But the reason that he started it was because of the Arab oil embargo. And the whole idea was, we're going to start this government department, and this department is going to make sure that we're no longer dependent on foreign oil. It was going to reduce our dependence or eliminate our dependence on foreign oil. That's how it was sold to the American public, and so we passed it. Well, back then, we imported, 40% of our oil back in 1979. Now we import 70% of our oil. We're so much more dependent on foreign oil now than ever before. Why do we need the Department of Energy? It spends $30 billion of our tax dollars every year. Why not get rid of it? Keep that money. And there are a lot of other things that we can do to shrink government. And that's the most important thing that we can do right now. And that's the reason that I want to go to Washington, is to put an end to this runaway spending and to let our politicians know that they are the cause of our problems. That we're not in trouble as an economy because of a failure of capitalism or a failure of the free market. It's because government didn't allow the free market to function. This is a failure of socialism. It's a failure of central government planning. It's a failure of central banking. They're the ones that created these problems. And one of the reasons that I can speak with a lot of credibility on these issues is because I predicted these problems. I was somebody who was going around the country warning about the financial crisis. Now, I first started going on financial television in 2005, and CNBC started calling me Dr. Doom. But I was going on every week. I was on CNBC, I was on CNN, I was on Fox, I was on Bloomberg, and I was warning about the phony economy that we had. I said we were living in a bubble, that our economy was a house of cards, that it was going to collapse, that the stock market would go down a lot, that real estate prices would collapse. I predicted that real estate prices would fall 30 to 50%. National average prices. I debated realtors, I debated bankers. Everybody said I was crazy, that it could never happen. I predicted on national television that Freddie and Fannie would go bankrupt, that General Motors would go bankrupt, that most of our financial institutions would fail. And I also predicted that the government would try to stimulate the economy in ways that would actually make the situation worse, which is exactly what they're doing. I was so concerned about it. Back even in 2004, I was writing op-eds to newspapers, warning about the problem. I authored a book called Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse. I wrote that between mid-2005 and mid-2006. It came out in February of 2007. It's since sold better than 200,000 copies, but it was written, before the financial crisis. Since 2008, you go into the bookstores, there's all kinds of books on the financial crisis. There weren't all those books when I wrote mine. In fact, I only found one publisher who would even publish a book which talked about the U.S. economy collapsing. People didn't think it could happen. But not only did I predict it would collapse, but I wrote the precise reason that it would collapse. So I think I have a lot of credibility to go to Washington and try to explain why they're doing so many things wrong. Because the people who they're listening to in Washington, people like Ben Bernanke, people like Timothy Geithner, these guys have never gotten anything right in their career. And there's proof of that all over the place. So, they continue to follow the people who have led them in the wrong direction. Why don't they listen to somebody's advice who actually has a track record of understanding what's going to happen? And actually, something happened today where I think this actually helps me in the general election with Blumenthal. But today, Blumenthal filed a lawsuit against Moody's and S&P over phony ratings, saying that the ratings, they rated stuff AAA and high ratings, and it really, it wasn't that good credit quality, and they're saying it was fraud. Well, that's great. Where was Dick Blumenthal 4 years ago? I was on television. It's all over YouTube. It was in my books. I was warning that the ratings were bogus. I explained exactly why those AAA ratings were bogus. I said that many of these bonds that were rated AAA should have been rated F. I said they were going to fail. I helped set up a hedge fund that shorted those bonds because I knew the ratings were false. I talked about the corruption in the rating agencies and how the rating agencies were in bed with Wall Street, but nobody cared. Because the politicians didn't care about this 4 or 5 years ago. They liked it. They wanted it. They nurtured the housing bubble. I mean, if Blumenthal is going to sue somebody, he ought to sue Chris Dodd. He was a principal architect of that bubble. But the politicians loved the real estate bubble because the voters loved it. Because it made them feel they can get rich for nothing. Washington didn't want to upset the apple cart, just like it didn't upset the apple cart during the NASDAQ bubble. I was one of the vocal critics of that bubble. When I first left Lehman Brothers, that was the job I worked at. I started my own brokerage firm. One of the first things that I did to build my business, and I was, cold calling from my apartment when I started out, I was warning people about the NASDAQ bubble. I was trying to convince people to sell their internet stocks. which wasn't an easy thing to do back in 1999 or 2000 because people loved these stocks. But I was trying to explain why they were going to collapse because it was all just a bubble. But Washington didn't start reacting to that and finding ways to pass new rules and regulations until the bubble had burst. They always close the door after the barn door after the horses have left. Because during the internet bubble, they didn't want to stop that because the public loved it and the politicians loved it because they kept getting reelected. So guys like Blumenthal, they love these phony ratings. Chris Dodd loved the phony ratings because it kept a lot of profits flowing on Wall Street, and Wall Street recycled those profits back into the pockets of those politicians, and it allowed people, constituents, to buy houses they couldn't afford and get rich in real estate. And nobody wanted to take away that dream. Nobody wanted to be honest and say, you just can't get rich buying real estate. You can't buy a house and expect to get rich. Nobody wanted to stop that. But I did. I was out there in advance explaining before it happened. So his ability to try to, grandstand now on that issue and try to say, you see, look what I'm doing with the rating agencies. Well, he can't beat me with that issue because look what I was saying 4 years ago. Where was he back then? So he doesn't have that issue the way he might have it against another potential Republican opponent. Anything he wants to say, I can show that, I was doing it 4 or 5 years ago. Where were you? But anyway, so I've got a lot of credibility, so not only in the election, but if I actually get elected, to go to Washington and try to convince the politicians that are there now that they've got it backwards. That every single thing that they've done to solve the problem, our economic problem, has actually made it worse. And that they are at fault. They are the reason the economy is in so much trouble. And if they keep repeating their mistakes, it's going to get worse. And the real economic crisis that I think is coming is probably going to hit in 2011 or 2012. And when I wrote my book, Crash Proof, and I predicted all these problems, the real crisis was not going to be the bursting of the housing bubble or the bankruptcy of our lending institutions or this huge recession. I knew that would be bad, but I thought the country could withstand that. My fear was the government cure. What I wrote about, what I was afraid of, was that the government would try to reflate the bubble, that the government wouldn't have the courage to let the market function, and they would try to bail people out. They would try to prop prices back up. They would try to artificially stimulate the economy by creating money and running big deficits. And that is exactly what they've done. And so now we are really on the cusp of a major, major economic meltdown. And I want to be in Washington, when it hits the fan. I want to try to prevent the politicians from making the mistake a third time. Because 3 times, 3 strikes will be out on this. I need to be there to put a stop to the next round of stimulus and to try to energize the other senators. All it really takes, I think, is 40 senators plus me to put a stop to it. I mentioned earlier that they raised the national debt ceiling by $2 trillion. What I want to do is make sure that that ceiling is real, that it's not an ever-increasing ceiling where every time they get to it, they raise it. I want to make sure that they don't raise the debt ceiling. Because if they don't raise that debt ceiling, if I can just get enough Republicans to stand with me in a filibuster, then that's it. They have to cut spending. They have no choice. They can try to raise taxes, but I won't let that happen either. Because if we have enough Republicans to block the increase in the debt ceiling, we have the same Republicans to block a tax hike. So they have no choice but to cut trillions of dollars out of the federal budget right now. Not 5 years from now or 10 years from now, but right now. And that's exactly what we need to do. We need to dramatically shrink government, not just what government spends, but we also have to reduce and repeal a lot of the regulations that are in place right now that are hampering the economy, that are hindering the free market, that are distorting decision-making and resource allocation, and that are undermining our economy. And, a lot of people say, one of the reasons that they try to criticize me is they say, well, you don't have any experience. You don't have any experience writing legislation. And I agree. I don't want to write any legislation. I want to repeal legislation. There's a lot of legislation that needs to be repealed. And when it comes to repealing legislation, I have as much experience as anybody else. Because nobody in Washington repeals anything. This stuff is there forever. They just keep adding more and more government as they go. And if I was on my video blog yesterday just talking about the growth of government. 100 years ago, the government, the federal government, the state government, and local government, all 3 levels of government, total government spending was 5% of our economy. 5%. That was all it was. There were no income taxes, there were no Social Security taxes, There were very few regulations, and we were a very wealthy country. We had an industrial